What really happens when private relationships collide with public fame? And more importantly, how much of what we hear about celebrities is truth? And how much is simply noise amplified by the internet? Today, we are looking at moments when partners, insiders, or close connections sparked rumors about some of hip-hop's biggest names. But as you listen, ask yourself, are these revelations, or are they just reflections of how quickly perception can become reality? Let's begin with a story that shows how little it can take to set off a firestorm. Ja Rule, born Jeffrey Atkins, walked out of prison in 2013 determined to rebuild his life. He had served his sentence, held his family together, and still had the support of his longtime wife, Aisha. From the outside, it looked like one of those rare stories in entertainment where a man survives public disgrace and still comes home to something solid, something real. But was it really that simple? Then, almost out of nowhere, the rumor mill started spinning. Online quotes, allegedly from Aisha, began circulating across blogs and gossip pages. They painted a dramatic picture of betrayal, infidelity, and even references to a bodyguard. The wording was emotional enough to feel personal, direct enough to seem authentic, and explosive enough to travel fast. In the digital age, that is often all it takes. One post, one screenshot, one anonymous source. And suddenly, a private marriage becomes public entertainment. But ask yourself, what happens when a story feels believable, even without proof? Ja Rule responded quickly and firmly, denying the claims and calling them fabricated and damaging. No interview ever surfaced to confirm the rumor. No evidence ever followed. And yet, the allegation lingered in the public imagination, because once people hear a scandal, many never fully let it go. Isn't that the real power of celebrity gossip? It does not need to be true to leave a mark. And here is what makes this story even more interesting. Despite everything, his marriage endured. That alone tells you something important about the difference between public narrative and private reality. Sometimes, the loudest version of a story is not the truest one. Sometimes it is just the most repeated. Now compare that to a very different situation, one where alleged evidence entered the picture. Benzino, a longtime industry figure, found himself in controversy when his former partner, Althea Hart, posted what she claimed were private text messages. These were not vague hints or carefully worded rumors. They were specific, direct, and loaded with enough detail to ignite immediate conversation. The internet did what the internet always does. It reacted first and asked questions later. Screenshots spread quickly. Comment sections filled up even faster. And suddenly, the story no longer felt like speculation, it felt documented. But did those screenshots tell the whole truth, or only one side of a much bigger argument? That is the danger of digital evidence. A screenshot can feel final, even when it may only capture a fragment of a longer conversation. It can be taken out of context, cropped, or framed in a way that changes how people understand it. Yet once it is out there, it becomes almost impossible to pull back. Benzino denied the accusations and threatened legal action, but he did not publicly dismantle every detail line by line. In a media world built for speed, that matters. Silence, hesitation, or even a partial response can be overshadowed by the emotional force of a post that spreads faster than any explanation. And so the damage is often done before the truth even gets a chance to speak. Because once a story is visible, it sticks. Now, consider a more subtle case. One built not on shocking evidence, but on carefully chosen words. French Montana's situation did not involve a scandalous screenshot or an explosive leak. Instead, it revolved around what was left unsaid. During interviews, Trina, who had been linked to him, spoke cautiously about their relationship. She described them in more limited terms. She avoided giving too much away. And at one point, she hinted that she did not want to expose him. That one phrase was enough to stir the conversation. Why does ambiguity have such power? Why can a pause, a vague answer, or a carefully controlled statement create more speculation than a direct accusation ever could? In public life, people often think clarity kills rumor. But sometimes the opposite happens. The less someone says, the more the audience fills in the blanks. French Montana brushed off the speculation, pointing to timing and context, while Trina's remarks remained open to interpretation. That is how reputations can become attached to whispers. Not always through accusation. Sometimes through suggestion. And suggestion, especially in the age of gossip blogs and viral clips, can be just as dangerous. Now let us step back into a different era, when rumors were not born online but sharpened in the heat of rivalry. Dr. Dre's name has long been tied to speculation that dates back to the 1990s, a time when hip-hop feuds were as public as the music itself. In those days, accusations were often used as weapons. They were meant to embarrass, weaken, or destabilize an opponent. Truth was sometimes secondary to impact. The goal was not always to prove something. The goal was to wound. Over the years, people connected to that era have revisited those claims in interviews and discussions, but no concrete evidence ever emerged to settle them. Dre himself never publicly engaged the story in a way that fueled it further. Instead, he kept moving. He kept building. He kept releasing music and shaping an empire that would eventually become a defining part of his legacy. So ask yourself, is silence avoidance, or is it strategy? In Dre's case, the answer may be somewhere in between. Sometimes refusing to feed a rumor is the strongest response of all. If a story is designed to pull you into chaos, perhaps the smartest move is to deny it the oxygen it needs. But for the public, silence can feel suspicious. People often interpret calm as concealment, even when it may simply be discipline. And then there are moments when the rumor is not whispered, not written, not inferred, but seen. Lil Wayne and Birdman shared a relationship that blurred lines in a way that fascinated the public for years. Then came the footage, a moment of them kissing, captured on camera and circulated widely. For some viewers, it was shocking. For others, it was confusing. How should people interpret a moment that looked so intimate but came wrapped in such a complicated history? Birdman later described it as an expression of love, comparing it to a father and son bond. That explanation gave the moment a different shape, one rooted in emotion rather than scandal. But once again, public perception had already raced ahead. People had seen the clip. They had formed opinions. They had laughed, criticized, questioned, and reposted. And what does that tell us? It tells us that in celebrity culture, context often arrives too late. A single image can create 1,000 assumptions before the first explanation is ever heard. Even when there is an explanation, not everyone accepts it. Some prefer the shock. Others prefer the gossip. Few are interested in the full emotional history behind the scene. That is the pattern running through all of these stories. Whether it is a rumor allegedly linked to a spouse, private messages that go public, cautious interview answers, unresolved accusations from old rivalries, or a moment captured on camera, the public often reacts to fragments rather than facts. We see pieces. We hear bits of dialogue. We read a quote, a caption, a repost, and suddenly we feel like we know the whole story. But do we? Maybe the real question is this: how often do we mistake exposure for understanding? Celebrities live under a spotlight that magnifies everything. Their relationships become headlines. Their silence becomes speculation. Their reactions become content for strangers. And once a narrative begins, it can take on a life of its own, growing larger than the original event itself. That is why rumors are so powerful. They do not need confirmation to spread. They only need emotion. Ja Rule's story shows how rumors can survive without evidence. Benzino's controversy shows how visuals can harden suspicion. French Montana's situation shows how words left half-said can invite endless interpretation. Dr. Dre's long-running speculation shows how old accusations can linger even without proof. And Lil Wayne and Birdman remind us that what the public sees is not always what the public understands. So where does that leave us? It leaves us standing at the edge of a complicated reality, one where truth, perception, and curiosity collide in ways that are not always easy to separate. It leaves us with a challenge: to slow down, to look more carefully, to question more deeply, and to resist the constant pull of easy conclusions. Because in the world of fame, the loudest story is rarely the most accurate one. More often than not, the real story is quieter, layered, and far less convenient for the narratives people want to believe. And maybe that's exactly why these moments continue to capture attention. They aren't just about celebrities. They're reflections of something deeper, about how we react, what we choose to believe, and why we feel such a strong need to interpret lives that we only see in fragments. But can we really understand those lives? Or are we simply watching shadows projected onto a screen, convincing ourselves that we know the people behind them. Think about it for a moment. Every image, every clip, every headline we see is just a small piece of a much larger picture. Yet somehow, those fragments become enough for people to form strong opinions. Why is that? Is it human nature to fill in the gaps, or is it something shaped by the culture we live in, one that rewards quick judgments and bold assumptions? So ask yourself, when we encounter something unfamiliar, do we genuinely try to understand it, or do we rush to define it in a way that feels comfortable? Wayne, for example, faced a wave of speculation that seemed to grow almost overnight. Images circulated. Conversations spread. Interpretations followed. But when he addressed it, his response was grounded in his reality, his life, his relationships, his family. He dismissed the rumors with clarity. And yet, despite his words, the images remained. And for many people, those images were enough. That raises an important question. Why do visuals sometimes carry more weight than direct statements? Why do we trust what we think we see more than what someone actually says about themselves? It's not a simple answer. Perhaps it's because visuals feel immediate. They feel real. They bypass explanation and go straight to interpretation. But interpretation is not the same as truth, is it? Then there's young Thug, arguably one of the most intriguing figures in this entire conversation. Unlike others who found themselves reacting to rumors, he took a completely different approach. He didn't wait for the conversation to start, he created it. Through his fashion, his music, and his public presence, he challenged long-standing ideas of masculinity. Dresses, nail polish, fluid self-expression, he embraced all of it openly, without hesitation. And naturally, people had questions. Some were curious. Others were critical. Many simply didn't know how to interpret what they were seeing. But instead of avoiding those reactions, he addressed them head-on. He made it clear that his choices were rooted in artistry, not in the labels people were trying to assign to him. And that leads to a much bigger question. Why do we feel such a strong need to categorize people based on appearance? Is it about understanding or control? Young Thug didn't wait for the world to define him. He defined himself. And in doing so, he forced the culture to confront something uncomfortable, the possibility that its assumptions might be limited. That kind of challenge doesn't just affect one individual, it ripples outward. It makes people question their own beliefs, even if they don't realize it. Now, if we shift our focus back to Birdman, we see yet another variation of how these situations unfold. Unlike silence or artistic expression, his response was direct and unwavering. He faced the rumors head-on, rejecting them clearly and consistently. In interviews, there was no ambiguity. He stood firm in his explanation of his relationship with Wayne. And perhaps what's most notable is that his stance never changed. Consistency like that raises an interesting point. Does repeating the same message strengthen credibility, or does public opinion operate independently of consistency? In other words, once people form an opinion, are they even open to changing it? That question doesn't just apply to celebrities. It applies to all of us. Because how often do we hold on to a belief, even when presented with information that challenges it? Not everyone chooses confrontation, though. Busta Rhymes took an entirely different path, one that might seem simple on the surface, but is actually quite complex. He chose silence. For years, rumors followed him quietly, lingering in the background. But instead of addressing them, instead of engaging or denying, he focused on what mattered to him. His music, his craft, his presence. And his career continued. Which brings us to another thought-provoking question. When someone refuses to engage with speculation, does that weaken the rumor, or does it make it more intriguing? Silence can be powerful, but it can also create space for imagination. Without a clear response, people are left to interpret things on their own. And when that happens, stories can take on a life of their own. So was his silence a strategy, or simply a decision not to give energy to something he didn't value? There's no easy answer, but the outcome speaks for itself. His legacy remained intact. Drake's journey introduces yet another layer to this conversation. Early in his career, he didn't fit the traditional image many people expected from a rapper. He was introspective, emotional, open about his thoughts and feelings in a way that stood out. And because of that, assumptions were made. Even within the industry, There were moments where people admitted they didn't fully understand him at first. He didn't match the mold, and that made him an easy target for speculation. But something interesting happened over time. Instead of changing who he was to fit expectations, he leaned into his authenticity. He continued to express himself in his own way. And gradually, the very traits that once raised questions became the foundation of his success. His vulnerability connected with millions. And the conversation shifted. So here's something worth reflecting on. How often do we misjudge people simply because they don't align with what we expect? And more importantly, how often do those expectations limit our ability to see things clearly? Drake didn't fight the narrative directly. He outgrew it. That approach is subtle, but powerful. It suggests that sometimes, the best response isn't confrontation, it's evolution. Then there's Jay-Z, whose situation operates on an entirely different level. At that level of fame, whispers are almost inevitable. The higher someone rises, the more speculation surrounds them. It's part of the landscape. In his case, there were moments when certain comments gained attention, particularly when they came from someone connected to his past. But even then, those comments were later clarified, reframed, and, in some cases, acknowledged as being misunderstood. And Jay-Z himself? He remained silent. Not in a passive way, but in a deliberate one. Instead of engaging with rumors, he focused on building something far larger. An empire, a legacy, a body of work that extended beyond any single narrative. And that leads us to a final, compelling question. At what point does success itself become the answer? When someone's achievements reach a certain scale, do rumors simply lose their relevance? Or do they persist, regardless of success, because curiosity never truly disappears? Finally, Eric's sermon provides a perspective that brings everything full circle. Unlike others who dismissed, ignored, or reframed speculation, he took a more direct route. He identified the origin of a rumor. He named the source. He explained the context. According to him, it wasn't random, it was intentional. A personal conflict that became public. And that detail is important, because it highlights something that often gets overlooked. Rumors don't just appear out of nowhere. They begin somewhere. With someone. At a specific moment. So here's a deeper question. How often do we stop to consider the origin of what we hear? Do we ask where it started, or do we focus only on how far it has spread? Because once a story begins to circulate, it can take on a life of its own. It evolves, shifts, and expands, often moving further away from its original context. And by the time it reaches a wider audience, it may no longer resemble the truth at all. So as we step back and look at all of these stories together, a clear pattern begins to emerge. This isn't just about celebrities. It's about perception. It's about how quickly narratives can form, and how incredibly difficult they are to undo once they take hold. And most importantly, it's about us, the audience. Because every time we click, every time we share, every time we comment, we're participating in that process. We're helping shape which stories gain traction and which ones fade away. That realization comes with a certain responsibility. So the next time you come across something shocking or unexpected, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, am I reacting to truth, or to a version of truth that has been shaped to capture my attention? Am I forming an opinion based on facts, or on fragments? Am I trying to understand, or simply trying to define? Because in the world of fame, and perhaps even beyond it, the line between reality and perception is often thinner than we think. And maybe the most important question of all is this. If we can't always trust what we see from a distance, what does it really mean to know someone?